What if the most dangerous move in this entire war isn't a missile at all, but a fleet that hasn't fired a single shot yet? Right now, in the waters off Iran's own coastline, US Navy's massive move in Hormuz is quietly reshaping this entire conflict. And Iran's worst nightmare just began, whether Tehran wants to admit that publicly or not. Before we get into it, if breakdowns like this one are exactly what you come here for, go ahead and subscribe and turn on notifications now, because this specific story is moving fast. And you don't want to catch up 3 days late in a comment section somewhere. Let's start with what's actually confirmed, because a story like this deserves the real details, not just a dramatic headline. Over the past several days, Naval Command in the region has quietly expanded its presence across the wider Gulf theater, building on a footprint that was already elevated after months of sustained tension. What makes this specific expansion genuinely different isn't just the number of ships involved, it's exactly where those ships are being positioned. Rather than clustering firepower directly at the mouth of the strait, the way earlier deployments typically did, this buildup appears to be layered specifically along the approach routes leading toward Iran's own coastal waters. Destroyers carrying fully integrated air defense radar, submarine support operating below the surface, completely unseen, airborne early warning coverage extending the reach of the entire formation far beyond what any single ship could manage on its own. That's not the posture of a force preparing to fight its way through a contested choke point. That's the posture of a force preparing to control who gets to use that choke point at all. And here's the detail that should genuinely grab your attention. This configuration doesn't need to fire a single shot to have a real effect. Just by existing exactly where it's positioned, it changes the math for every Iranian commander currently weighing whether it's worth testing these waters in the days ahead. If you're starting to see why this story is bigger than a single headline about ship movements, make sure you're subscribed, because the next part explains exactly why this specific formation is so hard for Iran to counter. And the answer has almost nothing to do with missiles. Here's the thing. Most coverage of naval standoffs like this one consistently gets wrong. People assume a story like this is fundamentally about firepower, about which side has bigger ships or more missiles ready to fire. That assumption misses almost everything that actually matters here. This entire posture shift was never designed to provoke a battle. It was designed specifically to avoid one, by making the cost of starting it painfully obvious before either side ever pulls a trigger. Think about what Iran's naval strategy has actually relied on throughout this entire conflict. Speed. Overwhelming numbers, genuine unpredictability, small, fast attack boats swarming a single target from multiple directions at once, hoping sheer volume overwhelms whatever defenses that target has available. Add in waves of relatively cheap drones designed to overwhelm one ship's individual defenses rather than rely on sophistication alone. That kind of strategy works reasonably well against an isolated target with limited awareness of the broader battlefield. It falls apart almost completely against a fully networked defensive system instead. Modern American destroyers don't operate as isolated units anymore, the way naval forces did even 20 years ago. They function as interconnected nodes inside one shared combat system, constantly exchanging information across the entire formation in real time. A threat picked up by one ship becomes a threat the entire fleet is already tracking before it ever gets close enough to matter. Layer submarines quietly underneath that network, feeding in data no surface sensor could ever pick up on its own, and you get something that isn't just difficult to attack successfully. It becomes genuinely difficult to even plan an attack against, because no commander can be fully certain what's watching them, or from where, at any given moment. That specific uncertainty is the real weapon sitting at the center of this entire story right now, not the missiles sitting ready on deck. The uncertainty itself is doing most of the actual strategic work. Let's slow down on that specific point for a moment, because it deserves more attention than a single passing mention. Uncertainty as a strategic tool works completely differently from raw firepower, and understanding that difference is genuinely the key to understanding why this entire posture shift matters as much as it does. Firepower deters through the threat of consequence. Uncertainty deters through the threat of the unknown itself, and unknowns are almost always more psychologically corrosive to a commander trying to plan an operation than a clearly understood, clearly quantifiable threat ever could be. An adversary facing a known quantity of missiles can calculate odds, weigh acceptable losses, and plan around a specific, bounded risk. An adversary facing a fully networked system, where the actual extent of surveillance and coordination isn't fully visible from the outside, has no reliable way to calculate those same odds with any real confidence. That's exactly why this specific posture shift is being read by serious regional analysts as something considerably bigger than a routine deployment rotation. It's a message aimed squarely at one specific calculation Iran's leadership has to make fresh every single day. Is today the day we finally test them directly? Based on everything currently visible from the outside, the honest answer inside Tehran appears to be no, at least for now. Now let's talk about why any of this actually matters beyond the water itself. Because the true target of a move like this one was never really the individual ships passing through Hormuz on any given day. The real target, sitting behind all of this positioning, is the government structure standing directly behind those ships, the one actually making every decision about how far this entire conflict gets pushed from here. Iran's internal system isn't one unified government speaking with a single voice. It's a layered structure, political and religious leadership at the top, claiming ultimate authority. Beneath that, a powerful military and economic organization tasked specifically with enforcing that authority whenever it's genuinely challenged. And underneath both layers of the actual Iranian population, tens of millions of ordinary citizens who've spent years absorbing the real cost of this entire arrangement through inflation, shortages, and restricted freedom. What actually holds that structure together isn't loyalty in any traditional sense. It functions through steady payment flowing down through every enforcement layer, salaries for security forces, funding for weapons programs, resources specifically designed to keep the enforcers loyal to the people issuing every major order. And almost every dollar funding that entire arrangement traces back to one source. Oil revenue, moving either through the Strait of Hormuz itself or increasingly around it, through alternate routes built specifically to avoid exactly this scenario. So when naval pressure tightens meaningfully around that specific choke point, this stops being purely a military story and becomes something considerably more dangerous for the regime. A genuine financial story. Every tanker that gets delayed, quietly rerouted, or simply discouraged from attempting a transit represents real revenue that never reaches the accounts responsible for keeping the entire enforcement apparatus funded and running smoothly. That specific pressure point is something traditional airstrikes could never accomplish on their own, no matter how precisely targeted or how frequently repeated. You can rebuild a damaged radar site within months given sufficient resources. It's far harder to quickly replace months of lost oil revenue at the exact moment your government needs that revenue most. And that's precisely why a naval posture shift like this one carries more long-term strategic weight than another round of conventional airstrikes ever realistically could. It doesn't just damage equipment sitting on the ground, it threatens the one resource this entire regime fundamentally cannot function without for any extended period of time. Let's dig a little deeper into that enforcement layer specifically, because understanding exactly how dependent it is on uninterrupted revenue flow explains why this pressure point matters so much more than it might initially appear. Security forces, regional proxy networks, and weapons development programs all require sustained, predictable funding to maintain operational readiness and continued loyalty. The funding isn't a one-time expense, it's an ongoing, recurring obligation that has to be met consistently, month after month, regardless of whatever broader economic pressure the country is simultaneously absorbing from other directions. When that recurring funding starts becoming less reliable, even before it fully runs out, the psychological and organizational effects begin well before any actual shortfall becomes publicly visible. Personnel start wondering whether next month's obligations will be met. Loyalty that was never purely ideological to begin with starts becoming considerably more conditional and considerably more expensive to maintain through other means. That's the quiet, compounding pressure a sustained naval posture shift like this one actually applies over time, distinct entirely from any single dramatic incident. It's not about winning one specific confrontation. It's about steadily eroding the financial foundation that the entire enforcement structure depends on to keep functioning smoothly. To be genuinely fair to Tehran for a moment, this isn't a government caught completely off guard by a scenario like this one. For years now, Iran has quietly developed alternate infrastructure, specifically designed to reduce its overall dependence on the strait as a single point of failure. Pipelines, alternate export terminals along different stretches of coastline, infrastructure meant to move crude to international markets without ever needing to pass through those narrow, heavily contested waters at all. The genuine problem comes down to timing and scale relative to the current crisis. Infrastructure built to gradually reduce a dependency over the course of an entire decade doesn't fully offset a sudden acute disruption happening in real time right now. And if key export terminals connected to that alternate infrastructure happen to sit anywhere near the current zone of naval pressure, years of patient investment could end up effectively neutralized by the exact crisis it was originally built to help avoid. Let's think through that alternate infrastructure a bit further, because it's worth understanding exactly why it hasn't fully solved the underlying vulnerability, despite years of genuine investment behind it. Building an alternate pipeline route or a new coastal export terminal solves one specific problem: physical access to open water without passing through the strait itself. It doesn't solve a second, equally important problem. Those alternate routes still require functioning ports, functioning insurance arrangements, and functioning buyers willing to accept cargo from terminals that may themselves eventually come under increased scrutiny once the primary route through Hormuz becomes sufficiently constrained. In other words, alternate infrastructure reduces geographic dependency on one specific waterway. but it doesn't fully insulate a government from the broader economic and diplomatic pressure that accompanies a sustained international standoff. A ship carrying cargo from an alternate terminal still needs insurers willing to cover it, still needs ports willing to receive it, and still needs buyers willing to risk the diplomatic complications that come with doing business under these specific conditions. That leaves Iran's leadership with a genuinely narrow set of realistic choices going forward, and every single one of those choices carries its own serious risk. Iran could attempt to directly challenge this naval buildup using whatever remaining fast attack boat capability and drone infrastructure it still has operational. Military logic strongly suggests that particular path would end badly, given everything currently positioned against it in these waters right now. But hardline factions inside Iran's own security establishment may genuinely feel enormous internal pressure to attempt something anyway, purely to avoid the domestic appearance of backing down. Iran could escalate its rhetoric and propaganda aimed inward, reassuring its own population that the government remains strong and firmly in control. Historically, that kind of escalating propaganda tends to intensify in almost direct proportion to how much genuine uncertainty leadership is actually experiencing privately behind closed doors. Or Iran could quietly return to the negotiating table one more time, absorbing a real political cost domestically in exchange for genuine economic breathing room. It may simply no longer be able to survive without much longer. Every one of these three options carries a meaningfully different kind of cost. And that reality is ultimately the entire strategic point behind this specific posture shift in the first place. It wasn't designed by American planners to force one single predetermined outcome onto Tehran through overwhelming force alone. It was carefully designed instead to make every remaining option available to Iran meaningfully worse than the option sitting right before it. Let's also consider how this specific standoff, regardless of its ultimate outcome, is likely to influence military doctrine well beyond this particular conflict, because a demonstrated deterrent posture like this one rarely stays contained to just the immediate situation that produced it. Naval planners in other countries, watching this specific approach unfold in real time, are almost certainly studying exactly how. Effectively, a networked presence-based posture can substitute for direct confrontation when managing a standoff against a smaller, asymmetric adversary relying on swarming tactics and unpredictability rather than conventional strength. If this approach proves successful here, expect similar posture-based deterrence strategies to become an increasingly standard tool in how larger naval powers manage comparable standoffs elsewhere in the world. In conflicts that may have nothing directly to do with Iran or this specific waterway at all, that broader doctrinal legacy, extending well beyond the immediate outcome of this specific standoff, may ultimately prove to be one of the more significant long-term consequences of this entire episode, regardless of which of the three paths Iran's leadership eventually chooses to pursue in the coming weeks. Let's take a step back and think about historical precedent here, because naval standoffs built around presence and patience rather than direct confrontation have played out before in different conflicts, and looking at those patterns helps set realistic expectations for how this one might actually unfold. Throughout modern naval history, there are repeated examples of a larger, conventional power establishing sustained, visible presence near a contested choke point, specifically to deter a smaller adversary's asymmetric capability, without ever needing to fire the first shot to achieve the intended strategic effect. In most of those historical cases, the standoff itself became the story, stretching on for weeks or months, rather than resolving through a single dramatic confrontation. The smaller power typically calculated, correctly in most instances, that direct confrontation carried too much risk relative to any realistic potential gain, choosing instead to wait, adapt, or eventually negotiate rather than test the larger force directly. That historical pattern suggests the most likely outcome here isn't a single dramatic naval battle capturing headlines for a day before fading from attention. It's a sustained, grinding standoff, measured in weeks or months, where the real story lives in economic pressure and internal political calculation rather than any single visible military engagement. Let's also think about the psychological dimension of this specific posture shift, from the perspective of the sailors and officers actually executing it day after day. Because sustained deterrent operations carry their own unique kind of operational stress, distinct from the stress of active combat. Maintaining constant readiness over an extended period without the clear resolution that combat itself sometimes paradoxically provides requires a different kind of discipline and endurance from crews who have to remain fully alert to a threat that might never actually materialize for weeks or months at a stretch. That sustained readiness, night after night, without the clarifying moment of actual engagement, is genuinely demanding in ways that don't always get discussed in coverage focused primarily on hardware and strategy. The human element of executing a deterrence-based strategy, like this one, deserves recognition alongside the technical and strategic analysis because it's real people maintaining that vigilance every single day this standoff continues. Let's talk about the financial cost of sustaining a naval posture at this scale over an extended period. Because deterrence through presence isn't free for the side, providing it either, even without a single shot being fired throughout the entire operation. Maintaining multiple ships, submarines, and aircraft in continuous forward posture requires substantial ongoing logistic support, fuel, maintenance, and personnel rotation, all of which carry real, sustained costs that accumulate the longer this specific standoff continues without resolution. That cost matters for understanding the broader strategic calculation on the American side as well. Sustained deterrence isn't a cost-free strategy simply because it avoids direct combat. It requires genuine, ongoing commitment of resources and attention, which means there's a real incentive on both sides of this standoff to eventually reach some kind of resolution, even if the specific path toward that resolution remains genuinely uncertain right now. Let's talk about how energy markets are likely responding to this specific posture shift. Because a naval buildup this significant near one of the world's most critical choke points rarely goes unnoticed by traders and analysts whose job is specifically to price exactly this kind of geopolitical risk into global energy markets. Markets tend to respond to sustained, credible deterrence differently than they respond to active combat. Active combat typically produces sharp, immediate price spikes as markets price an acute, current disruption. A sustained deterrent posture, by contrast, often produces a more prolonged, elevated risk premium, reflecting genuine uncertainty about how the underlying situation eventually resolves rather than pricing a disruption that's already happening in the moment. That distinction matters for understanding how this specific story is likely to be read by anyone with direct financial exposure to global energy markets, watching this exact standoff unfold with the same careful attention being paid by regional governments and military analysts alike. Let's also think about how this specific development connects to the broader diplomatic track that's likely running in parallel, even if it's not receiving the same headline attention as the naval buildup itself. Sustained military pressure of this kind rarely happens in complete isolation from behind-the-scenes diplomatic activity. Even while this naval posture continues developing publicly, it's reasonable to expect quiet diplomatic channels are simultaneously exploring whether this specific pressure can be translated into genuine progress toward a broader resolution, rather than existing purely as an isolated military story disconnected from the wider political context surrounding this entire conflict. That parallel diplomatic track, even when it's not publicly visible in the way ship movements are, often ends up mattering just as much for how this specific standoff ultimately resolves, since military pressure alone rarely produces a lasting resolution without some accompanying diplomatic process, eventually translating that pressure into an actual agreement both sides can accept. Let's think through each of those three options a bit more carefully, because the specific trade-offs involved genuinely matter for understanding how the situation is likely to unfold over the coming weeks. The direct challenge option carries the highest immediate risk, but also, paradoxically, the lowest political cost domestically, if executed even partially successfully. A single successful strike against an American vessel, however costly the broader retaliation that would inevitably follow, provides exactly the kind of dramatic, visible resistance that hardline domestic audiences respond to most strongly, regardless of the strategic wisdom of attempting it in the first place. The propaganda escalation option carries the lowest immediate physical risk, but the highest long-term credibility risk. Rhetoric that consistently outpaces visible, tangible results eventually loses its persuasive power with a domestic population that's watching the same economic pressure unfold in their own daily lives, regardless of what state media happens to be reporting at any given moment. The negotiation option carries the highest immediate political cost, since it requires publicly acknowledging, at least implicitly, that continued confrontation isn't sustainable. But it also offers the only realistic path toward actual lasting economic relief, which matters enormously for a government whose core stability increasingly depends on maintaining that steady flow of revenue we discussed earlier. Let's shift focus toward the technology actually holding this entire operation together, because this part of the story is genuinely fascinating once you understand how it functions in practice. American naval forces currently operating throughout this region rely on an advanced, fully integrated combat system linking every participating ship together into a single shared operational network in real time. Instead of each ship watching only its own radar and reacting only to threats it personally happens to detect. This network allows every ship in the formation to instantly share critical information with every other ship simultaneously. If one destroyer detects an incoming drone or picks up a suspicious missile launch signature anywhere nearby, that information transmits automatically to every other ship in the entire group within seconds, long before the actual physical threat ever comes close enough to strike successfully. This matters enormously against exactly the kind of tactics Iran has relied on throughout this conflict. Tactics built around overwhelming a single isolated target through sheer accumulated numbers rather than raw technological sophistication. In a fully networked fleet, every platform present actively contributes to detecting and intercepting every incoming threat simultaneously, rather than each ship fighting its own isolated battle alone. Underwater, submarines quietly contribute to that exact same shared operational picture, feeding critical information directly into the broader network without ever needing to surface. Above the fleet, aircraft extend that shared awareness even further outward. Put every one of those pieces together, and what Iran is genuinely facing right now isn't simply a group of individually powerful warships operating nearby. It's a fully integrated combat system, where every sensor, every ship, and every aircraft works together seamlessly as one connected organism. There's another layer worth paying attention to here, something that goes well beyond raw weapon systems and touches on something much harder to quantify: real operational experience. The United States has spent recent years conducting sustained maritime enforcement operations elsewhere in the world, quietly refining exactly the kind of specialized tactics needed to intercept resistant vessels, board uncooperative ships, and track targets attempting to disguise their true origin. That experience wasn't purely theoretical. It was tested repeatedly in genuine real-world operations against real, active resistance, long before this current conflict with Iran ever fully began. The crews currently enforcing this posture shift throughout the Gulf aren't simply guessing their way through an unfamiliar situation as they go. They've effectively done meaningful versions of this exact job successfully before, in different theaters, against different adversaries. That kind of hard-earned experience is incredibly difficult for any adversary to counter effectively on short notice, no matter how much raw military hardware that adversary might still technically possess. Let's talk about how allied nations in the region are likely reading this specific posture shift, because a buildup this significant rarely stays isolated from the perceptions and calculations of every other government watching from nearby. Gulf partners with substantial commercial and security interests tied to stable passage through these same waters are almost certainly watching this development closely, weighing whether it represents a genuine, sustainable reduction in risk to their own shipping, or simply another temporary escalation likely to ease once the immediate crisis passes. That regional confidence, or lack of it, shapes how willing those partners are to publicly align themselves with the broader pressure campaign currently underway, and how much additional support, logistical or otherwise, they're willing to quietly provide as this situation continues to develop over the coming weeks. Let's also think about the specific challenge this situation poses for Iran's domestic information management, because sustained naval pressure like this one is considerably harder to spin favorably for a domestic audience than a single contained military engagement would be. A single dramatic incident, win or lose, provides a clear narrative moment state media can shape and present according to whatever framing serves the government's messaging needs. A prolonged, grinding standoff without a clear resolution point offers no such convenient narrative moment, forcing propaganda efforts to sustain an increasingly difficult balancing act over an extended period, rather than resolving cleanly one way or another. That difficulty compounds the longer this specific standoff continues without meaningful change. Populations experiencing real, tangible economic strain in their daily lives tend to grow increasingly skeptical of triumphant rhetoric that doesn't match their own lived experience, regardless of how consistently or how forcefully that rhetoric gets repeated through official channels. This is ultimately why a sustained posture shift like this one carries a kind of compounding strategic weight that a single, isolated military engagement simply doesn't replicate. It doesn't just apply pressure once, it applies pressure continuously, forcing increasingly difficult choices with each passing week. The underlying situation remains unresolved. So here's where all of this actually leaves things right now, as the story continues to develop. For over 4 decades, Iran's regional power rested almost entirely on one simple, largely unspoken threat, sitting quietly behind nearly everything Tehran ever said publicly to the outside world. Control this narrow waterway, and you effectively control meaningful leverage over the entire global economy. That threat only ever worked as long as nobody seriously tested it enough to actually discover its true practical limits. Right now, in these exact waters, that long-standing test is quietly underway. Not through one single dramatic battle, but through patient, deliberate, methodical positioning, specifically designed to make Iran's own economic survival the thing genuinely hanging in the balance now, not simply its military pride. Here's the actual insight worth taking away from everything we just walked through. The most dangerous move in modern conflict often isn't the one loudly announced with a dramatic explosion. It's the one that simply sits there quietly, fully visible, genuinely capable, and endlessly patient, steadily forcing the other side to blink first. Whether Iran ultimately chooses direct confrontation, escalating propaganda aimed inward, or quiet eventual return to the negotiating table over these next several weeks, will tell us an enormous amount about how much genuine control Tehran actually still has left over its own next move. What do you personally think happens first here? Genuine, sustainable de-escalation, or a single miscalculation that neither side can realistically walk back once it actually happens? Drop your honest prediction directly in the comments below, because I genuinely want to see exactly how this community reads a situation this fluid before the next major development inevitably breaks somewhere. And if breakdowns exactly like this one, the kind that actually explain why something significant is happening, rather than simply repeating what happened on the surface, are genuinely what you come to this channel for, go ahead and hit that subscribe button right now. Because this particular story is moving fast, faster than most traditional coverage can realistically keep up with day to day. And I will absolutely be back here the very moment the next major shift out on that water actually breaks.